Hello, everyone.
Hello.
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 Hi, everybody.
So happy to be here with everyone tonight.
Awesome. Do you want to do introductions, or do you just want to get straight into it?
Sure. I'm James Landrith. Been involved with sexual violence work since 2008 when I first came forward with my own story. Joined the RAINN Speakers Bureau and then worked through Free New Sexual and Domestic Violence Action Alliance for a little while and some of the different caucuses and committees they had. Was a forum moderator for Pandora's Aquarium, which is part of the Pandora Project. Worked at RAINN for quite a while. Ended up being one of the senior managers for the Safe Helpline, and now I work with survivors in the military.
My name is Stephanie Jones. I'm a United States corpsman. I'm an E3. Despite me being in the military, what I say on this board is just as me as Stephanie Jones. It has no affiliation with the military or the government since I am active duty. I'm also a behavioral health tech, and I'm also a SAPR victim advocate for the military, Army, and Navy side as well.
So my name is Sue, or my full name is Dasu Tin. Sorry, I lost my voice earlier in the protest. Today I was outside the Chinese embassy.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tosin. He, him. I'm a social worker. I work with a lot of trauma clients. I also do therapy for individuals in a high school setting. I work with male identified survivors of sexual abuse as well.
I'm Velu. I am part of a coalition that we created about 2 years ago with several women that wanted to perform last thesis performance from Chile, A Rape is in Your Path. And I also do social media and engagement and activism on the side, as well as music.
My name is Tamika Spellman. I am the Policy and Advocacy Director for HIPS in Washington, D.C. I'm a Black transgender, unapologetically Black, politically active, big mouth. And I intersect on this conversation.
My name's Melly, and I'm right now working as a creatrix, which means I'm a creativity coach. Currently, I'm also in a master's program for psychology, and I used to work in multiple sexual assault organizations, particularly CARE to Stop Violence on the UMD campus, and also I worked with domestic violence survivors as a case manager. I've also worked with homeless individuals as well. So trauma has been a big part of my background.
My name is Alex. I am he, she, or they pronouns. I currently work actually with Tamika at HIPS. I'm the Outreach and Community Engagement Manager. But I have a very long history, as a couple other folks have mentioned, with work in trauma and also lived experience with a lot of trauma around sexual violence. I worked at RAINN for a very long time on their hotline. Worked at some local domestic violence shelters and also the local sexual assault organization here in DC. So that is my history here, and I will pass it hopefully back to Erin.
So my name's Erin. My pronouns are she, her, they. I'm also a social worker. I worked in treatment foster care for 6 years, mostly focusing on therapy with adolescent girls for the first 3 years, and then doing case management for the following 3. I've been in private practice now for about 6 years. I work with a lot of survivors, mostly domestic abusive relationships. I work specifically with the queer and LGBTQ community and trans youth. So I think trauma pretty much impacts just about like every aspect of what I do. And you know, in my spare time, I do things like this and, you know, make art that sometimes upsets people.
Well, I guess we should start the conversation.
I think to just bounce off of that and talk about like what happens within the body when trauma occurs, you know, like the neuroscience behind that. I study this a little bit, but essentially what happens when you have excess amount of trauma is that your amygdala is overactive. And in the trauma situation, your amygdala is overactive. So that means that it overpowers your frontal lobe that tells you what decisions to make. That's why a lot of survivors don't scream for help. You know, they don't like, they freeze because your brain goes into like autopilot and you start doing things that, but that's like what you feel like you have to do to survive. That's essentially how you dissociate. And then in addition to that, the other part that's impacted is your memory center, your hippocampus. So then when your frontal lobe and your hippocampus is damaged, right, then you can't discern whether you're in the presence of trauma or you're just triggered. So that's why even after the trauma, you go into a place where your memory starts to smell whatever cologne that was there, you know, during the trauma. And you start to dissociate and you start to feel like you're not safe. And that's what PTSD is. PTSD is that afterwards, even after the trauma, it impacts you over time because it's literally impacting your brain. It's literally impacting your ability to think straight and your memories start to clash and you have dreams and all these things start to come up. And it's a normal response for your brain to feel this way because you were in such danger, you did not feel safe.
This is a long-term type of problem. This isn't something that happened then, and I try to remove myself from that so it doesn't happen anymore. You know, I'm flourishing now because I've dealt with my traumas, and I try to keep dealing with it and talking about it so that it doesn't keep hurting me and I don't have these periods of bad dreams. Right. Because as long as I talk about it and I get it off of me, I sleep without dreaming. Mm-hmm. But when I don't, those dreams are horrible. I carry this with me on a daily basis and I have to mitigate so that I can be productive. Mm-hmm. And bringing about some change. I know I was a girl. I've always been a girl. I know I like boys. But don't take and try to minimalize the experience and say, okay, well, that's why you're like you are now. No, I was a girl. I was playing up already. And I have memories of that. But then there are a lot of cloudy memories and places and things and times that I don't remember. Mm-mm. It started with family violence because I was molested by a family member. And it set me up to hide the truth and I disassociated because I don't have a lot of memories of my childhood. And it's because of the trauma that I was receiving, I disassociated. When sex is not wanted, it hurts. And I was harming myself because I'm like, I have to be a magnet for this. I was blaming me because that's what society said. It was because you're out there wearing that miniskirt. You're wearing that tight-ass blouse. You got them high heels on, girl. Your ass is showing. But no. Just because I'm a sex worker does not mean that you have a right to assault me. That assault hurt. It has to be talked about. The culture behind police rape needs to be addressed. You know, there were instances when I would disassociate for so long, when I would come out of that mindset and I would come to myself. I'm wondering, well, where the hell am I at, and how long have I been gone?
That's trauma blocking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It would be days sometimes. It would be days because it was so harmful, and I would be so drained, and I would hide, and I would black out the windows, and I went through so many bouts of severe depression. The more you hide things, the more things won't change. We have to talk about these things and bring them to the forefront, and change the culture within the family dynamic so that people know that it is okay to step forward and say something.
Mm-hmm.
Do not be hiding these things, because this will mess with you developmentally down the road. And the goals and the things that you say you want to achieve as a child may not come into fruition.
Mm-hmm.
I know the things that I set out to do didn't happen that way because life was interrupted. Things happened. I had to shift gears and had to survive through a lot of what I lived through coming up as a child. And then to be repeatedly assaulted by people that are being paid to safeguard me. It
Yep.
we have a system that says that you can go to them for help. But how can you go to them for help if they're the ones that are harming you? When you do go to the system is not, it's set up in a way that they think is helpful. And sometimes it is harmful. It doesn't respect what I need as a person.
Yeah.
It respects that box that they try to shove everybody in. Sometimes we need to think outside the box. That's the problem, and why people do not talk about it. This
Yeah.
is why people don't come forth. Forgive me, but I am smoking because this is a very sore subject for me. And I'm not going to lie, I'm a little saucy. I've been drinking because this is how I cope. I may turn my camera off from time to time.
That's
Because
fine.
I was going to say, Mama, if it makes you feel any better, you're not alone.
yeah, this is hard. This is really hard.
Yeah.
I just want to back you up, Tamika, because I think you always touch on so many important things, but I think one of the things that I always think is important to pull out when we're talking about what is trauma is that I think for good reason, for understandable reason, we think of it as like a single incident, and it often can be a single traumatic incident. That's absolutely a type of trauma, and is one that we're discussing tonight. But there's also the kind of multiple other types and forms that trauma takes. Chronic developmental trauma, especially. So when you're I guess when I distinguish between those two, I say developmental more in the sense of it has a particular effect on your development in your brain when you're younger, when you're a child or an adolescent. Yeah. Which is not to negate it happening as an adult. It just has a different impact on the way that your brain develops because your brain is still so malleable at that time. And then on top of that, there's also intergenerational trauma and all of these systemic traumas that Tamika was talking about. And so I think like these things can layer, and you can have a single incident of trauma, but then you can also have chronic trauma that accompanies that, or intergenerational trauma that accompanies that, or any number of other things. I've experienced acute instances of sexual trauma, but often they were within a chronic circumstance. And so it's like, how do those things like interact and play with each other and make it more difficult, like to tease apart all the factors.
Yeah, and to bounce off that just a little bit, like you were talking about developmental trauma, Alex, and those same things that are impacted in the instance of trauma, like the amygdala and the hippocampus, like in children or people who are younger and developing, like can actually fully change the size, right, of the amygdala and of the hippocampus. And I think one of those things with trauma is like we oftentimes get a lot of emotional flashbacks But the absence of memory sometimes too, which can make it really hard for survivors to believe their own experience, especially because there's so much gaslighting, on top of that, right? Like your memory is not good. And then because like you've experienced trauma, right? Like we often say that like the lack of memory is, like evidence of trauma, like it's probably there. And then, when you're having a hard time creating a narrative or remembering, and then, we sort of talk about systemic, right? Like, and that systemic trauma, like gaslights people further, gaslights survivors further. And it's so incredibly pervasive, like you said, Tamika, in so many of our systems, and certainly like, in police culture, like to a really intense degree. There's so much toxic masculinity and rape culture and like white supremacy and all of these things, right? Like we talk about rape culture and it's not just like people, the act of being raped, it is like the act of the entire society, like it, not just like not preventing, but like fully allowing and oftentimes encouraging that, particularly like for people that are vulnerable. So it's so far reaching, right? Like it goes down to like the smallest little parts of your brain and the neuronal connections to like all the way, up in our overarching society. But you were saying, how like and showing up in the body, right? Like I know you guys are saying like, I mean, I'm over here like smoking too. So like, trying to keep that nervous system like calm down a little bit, but like, it really does impact. It's a fully embodied physiological experience. And so like everything is so wound in. And you become very like hypersensitive to stimuli, like as a general rule, because that nervous system gets overloaded much more easily. And particularly when it's complex trauma, right? It builds and builds and builds and builds. And, the more like, intersections it has, like the harder it can be, like you said, to tease all that out.
True. Yeah, it's criminal the way society does literally nothing to help children in these situations, as well as perpetuating the myth that you can shake it off, you're going to be resilient, it's not going to have lasting impact. And that starts right off the bat with bullying in the schools, which I understand a lot of school systems don't have the resources to really address it, but they do engage in direct victim blaming with that. Mm-hmm. And the second you start pushing back, that's when the victim is the one punished for defending themselves. And that teaches you at the bullying level, don't do anything because you're going to be the one in trouble. So then when something even more disgusting and vile happens, you can't trust the people who were supposed to be there for you in the first place. And it just continues to trauma on top of trauma on top of trauma until you don't think there's any direction you can go that's safe. Working on a hotline, working with kids was the most devastating because they literally had no one they could go to and talk to who wasn't a mandated reporter. And then if the social working system is not overwhelmed in that area, maybe somebody will come and check on them. And most unlikely, anyone's going to be taken out of the house. You're going to end up with a situation where now the perpetrator knows that they got turned in and things spiral out of control. And now it's even worse for the child than it was before. And this is so broken at that level. And then it leads to adults who don't have the ability to do what they need to do to help themselves because they've been told, what's the point? No one's going to be there for you.
Yeah, like James was saying, society is just broken, and it's even worse when it happens to adults because we know the different outlets, we know how to get help, we know how to reach for help, but there's a moment where like we just don't have anyone to turn to, or the society and the system that we thought would help us isn't helping us. I see it often in the military. It's sad that, like he was saying, like when it happens to you, it happens, and then the world just wants you to keep going on, go to work, push forward, pay your bills, but like something has happened to you and you have to be able to process it. And some people take, you know, a day. They're like, okay, this happened to me, I'm going to move on. Other people, it takes longer, but society doesn't allow people to heal from their trauma or their issues like at all.
How can we try to like approach this issue? I think it really comes down to being an epidemic, because a lot of these traumas really start at home. Everybody is different, and some people react to trauma differently, and they might experience trauma in different ways, and some people might experience something not, you know, like not right at the time where they experience the trauma, but in, you know, like later in the years, and it might not necessarily be emotionally, but it can also be physical. So a lot of the, you know, a lot of the diseases and a lot of the, you know, like the issues that we might face right now might have a correlation with trauma. Cancer, lung disease, heart disease, they are actually, they have been associated and directly correlated with trauma. So that's the problem. I think, you know, like if this was actually like managed as an actual like global epidemic, maybe people will be paying attention. There was, I saw a Facebook comment that was shared, and I think it makes it like it has to do a lot with the conversation as well. Like I feel it could be helpful to mention directly America's legacy of chattel slavery, how Black women were legally subject to rape, how Black men were required for survival to keep their mouths shut about it, how children of such violence were accorded in many cases higher status, and how this basic power dynamic of inflicting and perpetuating sexual violence through economic relationship has not essentially changed to this day. Systemic racism and rape culture go hand in hand.
I mean, after so many hundreds of years of conditioning, did you think it would change in just 100? I mean, and there wasn't really real freedom and equality. You know, we've had incremental steps that still have us bound. And it the biggest binding that still exists is up here. You know, we are harming and doing things because it has been conditioned into us. This goes all the way back to being trafficked and kidnapped and enslaved, bastardizing what is supposed to be in the Constitution with the separation of church and state, and putting a bunch of moralistic laws in place to control Black and brown bodies. And yeah, it affects other cultures as well, but to them, that's collateral damage, so long as it keeps us suppressed. This is not something that Black and brown people talk about. We're supposed to chuck it up and keep it moving. And in that systemic racism, there are other things that sprung from it. And that is one of the things is in Black culture, we have accepted that this is what is supposed to happen to us. And it is not.
I can see how counseling and therapy and everything that comes into mental health is so taboo in my community. It's so taboo. And I work with men who were abused as children, and they were never able to say anything, and it's affected their lives 10, 20, 30, 40 years after the violence, the abuse happened. You know, kids now struggle with you know, being able to express themselves and how they feel, because it's not something that you can do in the house. You know, hey, you know, something's going on with you. If something happened to you, you know, talk about it at home or pray about it, and you know, it'll go away. But you know, the counseling and the therapy that's needed for this healing is not afforded to our families, to our children, especially our young men. So like, you know, it's so deep in our culture, ingrained, that you can't seek help. And that's something that's actually a reason why I do what I do now, just to be able to reach people that look like me, that live in my community, and let them know that going to counseling is something that you can do, and it will help, and you don't have to deal with things alone, because more times out of not, you're not dealing with it, you're just concealing it, and you're blocking it, and it's gonna come out. You know, a little trigger here, and everything is gonna spill right back out, and you're back to where you was when the initial trauma happened to you. I think that's the monumental first step, to be able to say, this happened to me. Now, how can I heal, and how can I start to, get better and move on with my life from here on out?
I think that the main thing that we can do is to spread word and to have people like Tamika, like everyone here, to be outspoken and be a role model to like the future generations. But if people like us continue to push forward and try to make like create conversations like this, talk to our peers, tell our families and our friends that it is okay, tell our fathers or our brothers and our sisters that it is okay to talk about this stuff, and that it's it's okay to have like the taboos of like having mental health problems. It's such a big problem, like like just saying that you have anxiety, or that you suffer from bipolar disorder, or that you suffer from depression. Those things, like they need to be addressed and they need to be talked. Like it's just another problem that we have, and it's okay, we have to address it and we have to accept that this is happening, but how can we move forward to make sure that everyone has the support in our communities?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree. I think an important aspect of that, though, and I think that obviously everybody on this call is not, this is not about anybody on this call, but I think societally, often people get left stranded, right? Like if people do come forward, it's like, do they actually receive that support? Do they actually have a community behind them? And so frequently that's not the case. And so like, how do we build, like, we have to build a broader societal change. It can't just be survivors by themselves. And then no labor being extended beyond those very small circles of people. And I just don't think we can move forward without some kind of like broader societal investment, because this is affecting us in so many ways, and we could have a more like loving and compassionate and supportive society if we all approached each other that way. And that also includes, like, as you mentioned, like, yes, accepting like anxiety and PTSD and all those other things, but also accepting the less pretty things, accepting substance use, accepting other forms of coping mechanisms that are like deeply, deeply frowned upon and like often very, very necessary in this really, really awful system. Like sometimes maybe what feels like the only option for people at that time. Yeah,
I think a lot of people also don't realize that they have gone through trauma, or like they think that they're just some sort, like somehow like they just don't. But I'm like, one way or another, sure, I mean, there are different traumas, but the problem is that they just don't associate it with that. They're just like, oh, like I remember having a conversation with a coworker a long time ago. I was talking about how like trauma and abuse and domestic violence specifically affect a child or affect an adult, and her response was, well, the majority just bounce back. And so that's like that's the problem. The problem is that a lot of people assume that just the majority of bounce back. So
and don't recognize how they might be then like how that might lead to perpetuations. Exactly. Yeah.
Well, that's exactly, and that perpetuates the whole problem, because they're like, oh, you'll be fine.
Even those that they think have bounced back have life problems. They just are good at hiding it. As much science and research as there is available, why haven't they changed their ways? This is not like this is a new discussion, though. They have ample research, studies, and data.
Yeah.
What's going on with the legislators?
It's privilege. They want to keep their privilege.
But
100%.
Yeah, it comes from the patriarchal system, unfortunately. I mean, it comes directly from that. When should American schools begin teaching children about consent and rape culture? Since zero, since the beginning.
Kindergarten.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, kids get abused at a very early age too. You know, it should be taught. It should be part of the culture, within the culture itself. That, you know, like it should be part of you know, like education in the school, so that these kids are prepared and they know, because some kids don't even realize that they have been abused until later on, or like or at least that they know maybe there is a way to stop. You know, like even providing with like tools for them to maybe somehow protect themselves, but they don't even. I mean, like, you know, like you hear all these stories, you have all these people that you know, people that are close to you, with like horror stories.
Yeah.
And they didn't have any protections. So I think it should be part of the education system from the very beginning.
Children have sovereignty as beings as well, and I think our culture like really does not acknowledge that, like in a lot of ways, like children are treated sort of like possessions or accessories, or, you know, like a lot of things, but not necessarily as their own beings, because of that like backbone of like authoritarianism that runs through, you know, so much. But teaching kids as soon as they're able to, that they can say no, that they can say stop, that they can say I don't like that, you know, that they don't have to touch people if they don't want to, that they don't have to talk to people if they don't want to. And I think that can be taught in schools, but also just sort of taught within the day-to-day, right? Like supporting a child when they say no. But if the you know, there isn't that availability at home, like, which oftentimes there is not.
There's so many cases in the family that, you know, I think it's, to me, it would be in a way impossible at this point. But if we at least we can incorporate something in the actual education system, where they have access and where they, you know, they can know that they have a voice, and if something happens that they can talk, that I think that will help, you know, like change, you know, like the course of all this, you know, like rape culture and the cases of abuse. And also, you know, in terms of like mental health, you know, and how people are able to express themselves. Like, is it important to look for help? How can I heal myself? And all those things.
It's very important, because knowledge is power. And the sooner that we are instilling this knowledge into these children, the more that it will be accepted. And that message just doesn't get lost here. It gets spread.
Right.
You know, because children are resilient little people, you know, and we are not supposed to be possessing them. We're left here to be their guides. We are not to force it. I'm a Christian. So my way of interpreting is that they're lent to us to guide them in the way that they're supposed to go, not in the way that we are supposed to be molding them to go. We're supposed to let them children be who they are. And that means by giving them every tool that they need to be a successful adult. And tools are knowledge.
Yeah.
We're supposed to be teaching them the difference between right and wrong. And I see a lot of that male toxicity and things being taught from an early age, that boys are supposed to be this way and women are supposed to be this way, instead of teaching them the difference in between what's good for male gender and what's good for female gender. You know,
and everything in between.
Kind of messed up.
Yeah. Yeah, I think sex typing, like gendered behavior, starts being encouraged as early as like 3 or 4, you know, like really, really young, in ways that are so implicit in society. What you were saying, Tamika, makes me think of, there's that from Gibran, right, the prophet, about like your children, like seek not to like make them like you, but like be like them, because their souls belong to the house of tomorrow, right? That idea that, like, you know, it's not about us and what we think, or parents necessarily and what they think children should be, but like really about like enabling them to be who they are, which means a person that has boundaries and gets to say no, and, you know, gets to be self-determined.
We need to stop pushing gender standards on people, because I was not the gender that I was born. That's not what I was comfortable being. But because it was so forced on me, it made me have instability in my life because nobody understood. Let your children let you know who they are instead of us defining who they are, because that's harm that we're bringing to these kids. And especially when we're pushing that gender on them and telling them, you're supposed to be acting like this. And it's toxic. It becomes toxic to the kids. And then when we're being harmed and we're not being treated for the harms that we receive, we go out and harm others.
The binary is so incredibly destructive.
Yeah.
You know, on either side, because it's just like at this point almost like this caricature, like these expectations that are so completely and totally like not the way in which like people are supposed to be and to learn and to grow. I feel like there's a quote somewhere that I've read that's like, the first violent act of the patriarchy isn't like violence towards women. It's like telling, you know, men that they have to cut off an entire feeling part and you know, aspect of self, right? People who are gendered in that way. And, you know, I think that like we know, right, that if like emotions are not being like metabolized and expressed out in a way that is like healthy, like, you know, they're going to come out in other ways. So that's where we get that toxicity. It's where we get that rage, you know. So much of what comes into play in rape culture and motivates is like, you know, that space of all of this, you know, sort of swirling mess of emotion that never really gets expressed in ways or moved through in ways that are healthy, right?
Right.
You know, and then it shoots out all over the place. Then there's obviously choice involved in that as well, you know, like don't be wrong on that. There's no excuse for that kind of violence, but you know, you can sort of see where
you can find the root exactly.
Yeah.
I think it's important with any sexual partner that you have.
Go ahead.
To set the limits or to talk about what limits you have. Because in the act, you know, some people are afraid to say, no, I'm not comfortable with this. So speaking about like, this is what I'm willing to do, this is what I'm not. But knowing that no means no. And the military has a view that if someone is drunk, even if they say yes, like that's still not okay to have sex with them because they are technically not consenting because they're under the influence. So in like consent in the military is you need to be able to say sober and a verbal yes needs to happen. And if they say no, you at any point in time, like right at the end, like you need to stop that. No means no matter what.
I think also though I think I do want to take it a step back further because I like the word consent-based culture, and I think it speaks to something beyond like a one-on-one intimacy moment. And that it starts further back, like with more of a bird's eye view. It starts with kids. It starts with the way that we treat people, teach them about autonomy, about their bodies. I think from a very young age, children are frequently taught that they don't have rights to their own comfort, autonomy, body, you know, oh, don't mind, like that's your family member, they're allowed to kiss you or they're allowed to hug you or these things. And it starts early. And those things ripple and get ingrained in us and can have repercussions.
That's an excellent point, because I've noticed that I think back at my childhood and I remember vividly how I was kind of forced to hug people, you know, just like, hey, this is your aunt, give them a big hug. I'm like, I don't want to hug this person. And I think about how that cycles in your brain as you get older, and it's just like there's no consent, there's nothing that you have no say in that kind of interaction. So there's a question in the chat, and can consent be taken away afterwards? And absolutely it can. Anytime one person feels like they don't want to do anything anymore, they can stop. The consent is over, so you have to stop immediately.
On that hugging thing, I am a hugger, but I ask if it's okay. A lot of times people I'm familiar with, for real, because That's something that I noticed early on with my own children, was that forcing them to hug people made them uncomfortable. So I stopped forcing them to. That was up to them. It is their body. If they're not comfortable with someone, that must mean something. Children are the most resilient people that I know. But still, on that same token, if a child is uncomfortable with someone, it is upon us as adults to enforce limits.
What you were talking about, Tosin, like, and also Tamika and Alex, like, as far as children are concerned, right? Like, I read something today that was sort of talking about how, like, in consent-based culture, like, we raise children to, like, believe in the sovereignty of their own bodies and also the sovereignty of other people's, right? And so, like, you have the right to control your own body. You don't have the right to control the bodies of other people. And, like, I think that, like, we can take bodies and then extrapolate it all the way back out to, communication, right? Like, that's something that should be consented to. Like, you were talking about hugs, right? It's not just a sexual relationship or sexual touch. Like, it can be touch that, maybe you consider platonic, or subjects that you feel comfortable discussing or not. And teaching children, even just like, we, like, in our day-to-day of, like, having conversations, like, being able to, like, take a step back and say, hey, like, I need a minute for this conversation, right? Like, talking about, like, it can be really revoked at any time. And so, like, our sexual selves certainly are, like, a part of that sovereignty and that body. But I think, it pulls out to really any interaction that you're having with another person, or, like, you pull back out to land and to animals as well, right? Like, where are our lines with, like, other consciousnesses and how we consent? And I know that's a little bit broad, like, but I think that, like, when we talk about culture, it's like, how does that spread out, right?
There's also an aspect of consent being extremely specific that I'm not sure if we've mentioned yet. Because if I consent to going on a date with you, I'm not consenting to you kissing me or you going back with me to my apartment. If I'm consenting to one thing, there has to be consent for anything else that follows. So there's a level of specificity that has to be, verbalized and understood by both parties or whoever is involved in the act. That has to be acknowledged as well.
Yeah, I think in a conversation of consent, there also needs to be an opportunity to teach whoever is doing the ask to accept rejection.
Absolutely, like, 100% being able to teach people to handle, rejection gracefully. And I think that goes a lot to entitlement too, right? Like, the more entitled somebody is, generally, like, unless they've done that work, like, if they haven't, the more entitlement is there, the more intense the reaction to rejection is going to be. We've been seeing that, like, frequently, in terms of the terrorist attacks that happened on our country, right? Like, that is, if we're talking about consent, right? Like, that's, like, I can't think of, like taking a life, right, is taking that sovereignty, is, like, in its own way a huge violation of consent. But I think, it stems from this place of, like, people not knowing how to take no for an answer, because of that intense amount of entitlement.
I don't know what else to say except for it has to start with us as parents teaching our own kids, our family members, the right way to respond.
Yeah, I mean, like, if the United States, and if we talk about the world, I mean, we talk about other cultures, like, for example, like in Latin America is, it's something else, and the objectification of women there it's even stronger, if I dare to say. I'm from Colombia. Our country is extremely misogynistic and sexist, and homophobic, very religious. So it's a culture where, like, you're blamed because like the woman is always the like the one that was at fault if they're raped, and well, the men never talk about it ever. They never mention anything about it because like they have to show this like macho, like I'm the man, I don't show any feelings. So it's very pervasive. Like there is no way. I mean, if we have problems here about like equality, like I would say there like we're like 300 years behind.
Yeah.
And then we come here, cultures here that are from Latin America, is the same problem.
Yeah.
So and ultimately, I mean, and I hate to say this, but it's up to us to sort of have to like push towards change, like us, like my culture, like my people, to like push for some sort of change. Yeah, because like that would be the only, I mean, the only way to really like seek change, like somebody from within.
Yeah.
And it hurts and it sucks, but that's the only way to do it. So yeah, if we get to a point where we can actually like bring those things together, maybe we can have a better chance of including consent into more of our community and more conversations.
Mm-hmm.
There's a comment in the chat about a soft no, and I just want to be clear: a soft no is not a clear yes. So I think that's the best way to approach it. If it's not a clear yes, then it's still a no.
I think maybe misconstruing signals sometimes. People think that because there's a certain activity going on that it's okay, that you're okay with all of it, even though you've said no. No, I'm not. And no means no. There's no soft no. There's no medium no. No is just no.
The domestic violence one is really heavy because the violence aside, the abuse aside, even in a traditional marriage, if there's a problem and one partner says no, that's still no. I've heard so many horror stories about a partner being raped by another partner and people are like, can that happen? Can a husband rape his wife? Yes, 100%, and vice versa as well. So I think that's something that is so under discussed. Like we don't really talk about rape between intimate partners who are actually like in a committed relationship with each other. That's something that happens as well.
Yeah.
Taboo, but it's still very real.
And it wasn't even, I mean, not that I value the law very heavily, but it wasn't even illegal for a very long time.
Mm-hmm.
It was not actually considered legally rape or sexual assault for a very long time. I know this is probably not the intent of the question, where in a state of altered consciousness does consent disappear, but I actually think that this discussion about wearing down people is a state of altered consciousness. It's a form of abuse, and it changes your ability to trust and understand your own instincts.
Mm-hmm.
After you've been told your no is invalid for long enough, you don't know what you feel or think anymore. It's gaslighting. It's an abuse tactic, and I don't consider a quote unquote yes or even a I guess so actually a true signature of consent, because it was not given freely and it was not given enthusiastically. It was given after wearing somebody down.
Death by 1,000 tiny cuts, right? When you're, that sort of like no is worn away, almost like you're wearing away, like building material or the structure so that the barriers become semi-permeable, right? And we see that in long-term abuse, but we also see it just like even in media reactions, like when topics of sexual assault come up or sexually based like crimes and killings or offenses, like there's always that sort of gaslighting that's done to even just trying to make it about like a single thing and not about a culture, right? And it's it's done at length, and it's it's as innocuous as like Snow White in the forest getting kissed by some strange dude. Like, you know, that's the fairy tale, right? And so, like, I think, you know, we talk about like wearing down. I think wearing down doesn't even have to necessarily be like directed harm. Like, it's also by a culture in general, and sometimes it doesn't look like wearing down. It looks, you know, a lot more innocuous than that. And those blurred spaces, right, or implicit spaces are like where we get a lot of our information. And so I think, you know, like speaking about things openly and directly, like kind of takes away that like implicit learning and instead says like, this is what we're going to be learning directly about this, you know, about what consent is.
Yeah.
It brings back to me how much it hurts everybody though. And I think that like this is the part that sometimes gets missed, is like it's also really toxic that like that we set up this expectation that people are to be pursued and that your value or worth as whatever. I mean, usually this is a coded masculine, but it's not exclusively coded masculine. Like your worth is whether or not you can conquest this person, and like that's these things are not it's not good for anybody, and it doesn't like allow genuineness, and it doesn't allow for, you know, vulnerability and conversations on that end either. And there's expectations put into place that like you're just gonna like, you know, want this, and men are just gonna want sex, and men are just gonna be good at it, and blah, 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 blah. And like that doesn't help anybody in either direction, and it doesn't represent reality, and it's so gender essentialist, right? Like there's such a broad spectrum of people's interest in and physical and emotional and psychological like connection to sex and intimacy and what that means, and this the culture that we've created is this binary, and binaries are so violent, and this is such a clear example of it, where like by pushing people to these extremes, we just ignore all of the beautiful nuance that can come with like conversation and consent and like having really intimate like vulnerability with each other. I mean, it comes down to vulnerability. Like consent involves vulnerability on both sides, because you're being honest about your needs and desires, and you might get like rejected, and you have to trust that that doesn't mean that like this person like hates you or whatever. It's just like could be any number of things. There's a vulnerability that comes with the ask, and there's a vulnerability that comes with like the response. And vulnerability is not something we like are super good at in this culture.
To me, I feel like when I think of sex positivity, I think of like engaging with sex and sexual concepts without shame. I think of like destigmatizing sex work and like supporting sex workers. I think of, you know, the opportunity to just for everybody to love and like, you know, have sex with whoever they love and want to have sex with. And also like, you know, I think probably the concepts of enthusiastic consent around sex positivity too.
So yeah, when I hear sex positivity, I know a lot of people get confused and think that it means promiscuity, and that you're just having sex all the time with anybody whenever, which if that's what you want to do and you have consensual partners, hey, go for it. But people were so confused by it because they don't understand consent. And they don't understand somebody wanting to do something and choosing who they do it with and what the acts will be. And there's so much puritanical energy just wrapped up in all the institutions in the U.S., including the government. Most of our laws were based on religious dictates, and a lot of it conservative Christian over the decades. And that's why people are so hung up on somebody owning their own sexuality and doing what they want with willing consensual partners who are capable of meaningful consent. Mm-hmm. As somebody who was my rapist was a woman, and that throws a lot of people off, and they don't understand how a man cannot want to be with a woman at any time. And it just takes a lot of discussing what consent is, because consent is completely broken in this country. It's not taught in any meaningful way. Health classes don't really cover it, because we have so many political and religious groups that just don't want you talking about it in any way, shape, or form.
I think it's a complicated question. sex positivity because I think that once we as a society starts accepting sex work as real work, then sexual victimization would lessen, right? And so for me, because I've worked with a lot of sex trafficked victims, when they hear about sex positivity, they think it's not a good thing. And it's because they have been sex trafficked, forced into this unconsensually. And so I would explain that if we take a legal stance, then trafficking women would stop because there's legality behind it and there isn't stigmatization. So like for me, I had personally worked on relocating someone, an indigenous woman, an indigenous Myanmar woman who was sex trafficked. And when she was sex trafficked from my country of Myanmar to Thailand, and she was raped by Myanmar military people and a numerous amount of people in Thailand and expatriates or white Americans that go into Thailand for sex. And so she had a child who she conceived from the military. And from that, he started to look like her victim, like her victimizer. You know, he's the one who got her hooked on heroin so that she would continue to be a prostitute without her consent. And so that the child started looking like the rapist. And so she could not ethically raise him without, she didn't want to be mean to him, but you know, it was triggering. So I had to help to relocate her son. And when she heard about, you know, Western people being very like, yeah, gung-ho about like sex positivity, people like that would get hurt behind it because like that wasn't consensual. But what needs to be explained is that like consent is very important. So that's what stops things like this. Underground trafficking of indigenous people all over the world, including America. And so that is, and everyone else too. Like, so that's my 2 cents. I think it's a complicated question. So I can see from other people that are opposed to sex positivity, why they're opposed to it. But I think it's because there's a miscommunication within the term sex positivity. I don't know. It doesn't make sense for the media to teach one thing and then for this new sex positivity type of drive that's going on, you know? Because in one sense in the media, yes, like I think it's amazing for people to dress however they want to, and but also to not have that expectation if they don't want to either, you know? And I know that young people are very impressionable, and if they are exposed to culture that is the opposite of consent, then that's what they're going to end up doing. That's what's raising them. That's what's shaping their paradigm, and that's all within patriarchy. So when we talk about rape culture, dismantling rape culture, we have to dismantle patriarchy, or else it's irrelevant. Like, for example, people learn about sex through porn, and I don't think porn is necessarily bad, but I think that the people that had the most control of porn were white men that were cis. You know, for bi men, it's very difficult after they have sex with a man because of homophobia to go back into having sex with women in porn. Like, they're seen as gay now, right? But that doesn't make any sense. So things like that. I think that, like, you know, when we talk about media, we also need to talk about what teaches our children. And most people learn about sex not through sex ed, but through porn. And so that is another aspect of it as well.
And even like you mentioned teaching our children, you know, I'm just thinking about what Disney taught me growing up, right? Like Sleeping Beauty, that was so weird that like just someone who's sleeping and like someone can just kiss that person and that is okay and that is a happy ending, right? Like that kind of stuff is so ingrained within our psyche that we don't think twice about it. And then when we grow up, that's like the type of stuff that we kind of I guess like that's what comes out, you know? That's exactly what happens when we are taught that as children, that this is okay and this is what love should look like. And that is really sad. And I think that you brought up a really good point about how porn teaches children how to have sex, because we don't teach that in school. We don't teach what consent is. We don't teach what like good and positive sex is. I think that goes into that victim blaming culture as well, right? Like this idea that, well, he was just where they were just trying to pursue me, and they were just trying to, make me feel wanted, right? Like this is what I think last time we talked about with the confusion that comes with being sexually harassed or assaulted. It's like, I know in my body that did not feel right. And I know that I was not consenting to that, of my boundaries being crossed. But society and the media and everything else is telling me that this is okay. And so that's where this like dissonance is coming in. And it makes it really hard for us to overcome the trauma that comes with being sexually assaulted, when we're not able to fully process that, when we're feeling that confusion and blaming of ourselves.
So I'm going to read the question. How do men's rights intersect with rape culture? So for me, there was a men's rights activist who assaulted a friend of mine who's a permaculture teacher. And he was saying that it's his right. You know, he blocked her from leaving. He made her feel uncomfortable. She asked him to move away. He didn't move. So she pushed him so she could leave. Right. And so when when she pushed him, he was like, okay, well, she's physically touching me, so I have a right to defend myself. So he choked her from behind and put her in a Nelson. And he kept on repeatedly hitting her. And she finally got away. And this man, he's in a teaching position. He teaches young women permaculture, and he's a self-proclaimed men's rights activist. And with a lot of the rhetoric from the men's rights activists, they talk about them being able to fight a woman back because they feel like it's uncalled for, stuff like that. And I think that when I tried to hold a community meeting and all of this stuff, I was blamed for being a troublemaker and also gaslit. And also my friend, the victim, she was asked to stand in front of him for a peace and reconciliation meeting. So that type of, and this is a nonprofit. So that's what's happening. And this is the DMV area. That's what I think about when I think about men's rights. I really do think that men do deserve rights, but I think that someone that is victimizing other people cannot use a men's rights platform to harm people and to assault people, like assault women and sexually assault, victimize, all of these things. That is not all right. And I think that's one aspect of how those two are tied together.
It's definitely a spectrum. On one side, you got people who are trying to use it as an excuse to do whatever they want to do, shaming victims, promoting toxic cultures. And on the other end, you have people who are maybe talking about things like how men don't get therapy and how we try to shrug off depression and things like that. One side's much, much louder than the other on the internet, for sure. Male survivors constantly get lumped in as if we're all MRAs. Aside from also all the gatekeeping that goes on in survivor advocacy groups to begin with. And having been a trained victim advocate for years, I see that from all sides. But yeah, it's a spectrum, but the loudest ones are the ones who are doing the worst damage. And unfortunately, they seem to have really loud, really large platforms and seem to be really good at social media, which is pretty scary. I've had folks come after me because they said that there's no way what happened to me could have happened. I must not be a real man. My status as a Marine Corps veteran was attacked, and a whole bunch of stuff. And there's this one wingnut out in, I think it's Finland, who just has an obsession with talking about me all the time in my case and telling me about how I am a sex negative activist because I didn't like being raped. Yep, that's an actual thing.
Men like are so much less likely, to report, because of toxic masculinity, which is like being manifest in that way. And, it's just, I think, like MRA in that form is like another form of silencing, right?
Yeah, and again, I feel like that's patriarchy because that doesn't allow men to have consent. They're always considered always down for sex, and that like this idea of men being quote unquote stronger, so they should be able to resist women that are considered weaker. That's totally ridiculous.
Yeah.
Men are also victims of rape. Non-binary people are also victims of rape, and rape is rape, and we need to address it as such.
All I keep thinking about is toxic masculinity, and how you have, it's just, it's so pervasive.
At some point, whatever you're doing that has been an affront to someone, when you rape someone, that is a mental health challenge to me. To think that it's okay for you to take that type of power over someone else and not be held accountable for it. The victim always ends up being blamed and questioned like they're guilty.
We sort of touched on this a little bit earlier, but can kind of, unpack it like, as it comes to sex work. Like, I suppose my like perception is that I really feel like sex work is healing work. Like, it is, it's connection. There's a level and degree of intimacy there. And so like criminalizing sex work really deprives people of like what is a basic human need, right? To connect, right? Whether that is through, I know that sex isn't like necessarily a drive. It's not like hunger or thirst. We don't die without it, but like we do die without touch. We do die without connection. And for a lot of people, even babies, right? Like who don't connect, or have a mother who's sick when they're born, end up like with failure to thrive. Like they literally shut down without human touch and human connection. And we're not any different as adults. And so criminalizing sex work, leaves a lot of people without an avenue to have that kind of connection, and to have it safely and to have it in a way that, like meets them where they're at and meets needs. And so I think that directly contributes to rape culture because like, you have all of these people with these unmet needs, with these feelings of lack, with these like, this lack of touch, this lack of that connection. And that fosters, all manner of, sort of like toxic mindsets and mentality, right? Like scarcity mentality.
Yeah. And also like if you criminalize sex work, then other jobs also get affected. Like me as a medical massage therapist, I'm not a sex worker and I do not shame sex workers, but I do not want to be seen as a sex worker. And so there's a incident that happened in Ashburn, Virginia, where I was asked to come in for a second verification that I'm not a prostitute, which is crazy. So I went in because I took an FBI background check and they said they needed a second background check. And so I went, and when I went, it was all Asian women lined up. And we were asked questions like, what part of the body do you massage with? Like, I'm a medical massage therapist. I'm not sexual with my patients, but there's that aspect in there. And the fact that I am Asian and I am indigenous, it's easier to sexualize because of exoticism. And also, like, I've been sexually assaulted at work numerous times, where when I used to have dreadlocks, which was last year and like the year before, and I would go to work, there was this one man who grabbed my hair and pushed me and undraped himself, pushed me towards his dick and said, suck my dick. And that, and I tried to call the cops, and I had to quit that job because they wouldn't let me report. And also the same police officers that was questioning if I was a prostitute or not, blamed me and said that it's because, I'm very sexual. And I don't think there's anything sexual about being a massage therapist. And that is what criminalizing sex work does. It perpetuates this type of like racism where like Asian women or like women of color or like trans women, like these like niche people that like people want to victimize. And it's okay for them to victimize because this is seen as illegal work. And so then you, the victim, automatically become doing something illegal.
Yeah, I mean, I think like by criminalizing sex work, it's telling sex workers that they don't deserve protection. That because they're engaged in this work, then anytime they get assaulted, anytime that they get physically assaulted, they can't call the police for help because they're engaging in this work, then they should know that and that they deserve the like the punishments and the assaults. And I think that just shows like the government's perception of what sex is, of like what sex should be like, where we are not able to claim our bodies and we're not able to say that, just because I'm exchanging money for sex, like I'm able to have the same basic human rights. And I think like when we put it into that context, then sex trafficking can become so much easier, where people are not consenting to being sex workers, and it's because that they're not going to get the protection from the police, and there's not going to be any accountability and consequences for the people of sex trafficking them.
Yeah, so like globally, for example, when Latinx women get taken, for example, from Colombia to Japan to be sex workers, they usually prosecute and criminalize these sex traffic victims. But the smugglers, the pimps, the gangs that are affiliated with it, like Yakuza, nothing happens. So this is like a global problem where sex trafficking is attributed with prostitution being illegal. And so like, when one starts to be addressed, then the other will be,
That's why I work so hard to decriminalize sex work. Because of the victims of trafficking. Why are you arresting a victim? That makes absolutely no sense. Why are you criminalizing someone that is being coerced into doing sex work? It's different if I'm out here doing it of my free will. I shouldn't be criminalized for that either. It's absolutely ridiculous to be monitoring people's casual sex tendencies when casual sex is something that is celebrated so long as it's a man doing it. Men can go in bed 1,000 women and they're celebrated. But let a woman do the same thing, she's slut shamed. I'm not a slut. I am a sexual being, just like everyone else. And for government to continue to steal my autonomy and agency over how I choose to use my body is ridiculous. They don't have those type of regulations on people that play hockey. They go out there and they physically abuse each other. Boxing, physical abuse. It's the same thing. You're using your body to gain money. But you criminalize me for using my body to gain money because I'm having sex. It's the strangest thing how people could lust for seeing blood. But let that blood come from a sex worker. Oh, well, you shouldn't have been out there. No, that's not how that works. If a football player breaks a bone while they're playing football, oh, he's a hero. They're so strong and courageous. Let me live through a rape. Well, if you weren't out there, if you weren't wearing a mini skirt, if you weren't out here sex working, maybe that wouldn't have happened to you. It's a double standard that shouldn't exist.
Also, like going back to the trafficking, like there's a story of this woman who was kidnapped. She's an indigenous person from my country, from Myanmar, and she was kidnapped and shipped to China. And so we were looking for her for a really long time, and her sister was also kidnapped. And so when we finally found her in Xijing province, her legs were broken, so she couldn't escape. Like, this is the level of violence I'm talking about. She's given birth to over 10 children, and her sister is totally gone and missing. So her sister, we don't know. And we think they killed her. And so this is the result of sex trafficking. Same thing with indigenous people here. There's a Lumbee woman that was in Baltimore. I was working with the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women movement. And because they're stuck in this loophole of not being considered real citizens, the Native American police cannot press charges to non-Native Americans. So if it's a non-Native American, usually white men, that go into those spaces and rape women or like abduct them, kidnap them, do whatever they want, and dump their bodies, there's nothing being done about it. The FBI is like, oh, that's the Native American police job. The Native American police are tied with litigation, so there's thousands of women missing and murdered. With the Lumbee woman, we were putting pressure for Baltimore County Police, and finally they found her body. Finally. That was 3 years ago. And so like that's totally ridiculous, and that is the direct result of criminalizing sex work. It's a direct result of not teaching consent, of as a collective not holding people accountable. Because when you let these small things slip, then there's these major things that happen. And then now we're like, oh, this is a problem because there's a body attached to it. It shouldn't get to that. And one race, one gender, or no gender should not be held less sexual or more accountable or less accountable. Everyone should be accountable for their own actions, period.
We have a question there standing about what is rape. Who would like to start? It's a heavy one.
It's a heavy one.
I know.
Yeah, it's a heavy one.
Yeah. It's really difficult, I think, to describe sometimes because there's so much gray area that comes with rape. Sometimes your brain goes on autopilot in those situations. And for me, when I've experienced those situations, my autopilot is like, minimizing it and just saying like, oh, they didn't mean to do that. Like, I don't understand how that even happened. Like it, I would just push it aside. I don't know. For example, with gray areas, it's like, you know, could I have spoken up more? Could I have done this more? And at the end of the day, it's like, you know, this person crossed your boundaries. And to be able to validate that, I think is the biggest process in the healing.
When you don't say yes, that's rape. Rape is when you are not consenting to any sexual activity.
Yes, I was gonna say, I'm glad Tamika used the word consent. I was gonna say anything that happens to your body without your consent is considered rape, where somebody else is taking pleasure from your body and you have no authority, and your authority to say yes is taken away from you. That's rape. So consent is a very big word. Thank you, Tamika, for using that word.
The harm that comes from being raped does not end when the rape stops.
What can we do to stand in solidarity to prevent this rape culture? Because right now I feel like even though there's a lot of good intentions in nonprofits, grassroots organizations, there's a lot of opposition, even though like right now it's savvy to say like I'm with her, or you know, the Me Too movement, but where's the actual resolve? Like what can we actually do to reach some type of solidarity? Because a lot of people of color don't trust the police, right? So can we take a legal way? How do we hold community members accountable without having the victim having to sit in front of the perpetrator?
Yeah.
Because that's usually the resolve. Even if a woman stands up, or a man stands up, or a non-binary person stands up, like, okay, what now? Okay, we know this is a problem. Let's dismantle it. How do we get there?
You know, like a woman shouldn't have to go to a rape center right after being raped and then have the doctors stick something, you know, up them in order to gather evidence for that to be valid, for their pain to be valid. One thing we have to recognize is that intention doesn't equal impact. And so much of the defense from the perpetrator side is, oh, well, I didn't intend to do that. Well, the fact that we're having this conversation, the fact that we're sitting in front of court right now shows the gravity, shows how much impact that you've had on this victim. And so that's one thing that we can start to bring forth to light, like, you know, how much reporting is like really low, and also how can we encourage what survivors to report and like support their stories.
That's one of the barriers to us talking to the police, is that they're going to try and criminalize me still because they know I'm a sex worker.
Right.
And I don't need you trying to put me away for loitering or soliciting when I'm trying to tell you about myself being robbed or someone else.
Yeah.
You need to be trying to focus on the offense that I'm trying to talk to you about, instead of trying to look at me like, how can I take your ass to jail too?
Yeah, big issue in the military is what's called collateral misconduct, where a victim will be afraid to make a report because there may be something else that's minor that went on at the same time, say drinking underage at the time the assault happened. And they may get in trouble for that because you're going to have to explain the circumstances of everything on the record. And then the rapist still gets to walk free, and you're in trouble for something that nobody would have known about.
Right.
And theoretically, they have people that are there as victim counsel to help you with that, but there's no guarantee whatsoever they can squash those charges, regardless of what might be said publicly.
And there's reasons, I mean, they brought up earlier, but there's other reasons too why people don't, you know, especially children, right? Like mandated reporting was brought up earlier. And I know that mandated reporting laws were put out in good intentions, and that they have a reason for existing, but I can't reinforce what James said earlier enough, that like the sheer volume of times that we have spoken to children who would never reach out to anybody because they knew that they knew what they were up against, then I would be lying, like, to say otherwise. Was disturbing, is disturbing, continues to be disturbing.
There needs to be a wide range of options. You know, everybody doesn't want to go through the whole process of having someone prosecuted. You know, we need to be able to report anonymously. You know, it's enough to deal with the trauma than to be traumatized again because of 1,001 people coming at me asking me what happened. Stop asking me. Stop trying to slip me up and make me say something else. Once I've told you what it is, leave it there. They're not being thoughtful about the trauma that they're causing in order to get to the bottom of the problem.
There needs to be a range of options, and also like a much more like a much wider window of when people can report, right? Because the statute of limitations is way less than it should be. And, you know, a lot of times people are so traumatized afterward that they can't even name what's occurred, right? If we go back to naming it. And so, like, you know, not that I think that the legal route like works, but at least to have there be a window for people to like get healing, right? And that I think goes with our culture and trying to change like how people are met. Like, you should be met the same way whether you were raped yesterday or 5 years ago, you know, because for some people it can take 5 years to even be able to talk about it.
There shouldn't be a statute of limitation on violent crimes. You know, so even if like for murder, there is not a statute of limitation on it. But you can violate my body and in 5 years, it's not valid anymore.
Right.
That doesn't make a bit of sense. There should be some kind of accountability. Even if it isn't, I'm trying to prosecute you and have you jailed.
Sexual assault is a violent crime. And how with murder, we don't have people asking, you know, why did you report earlier? What were you doing? What were you wearing? You know, these kind of questions is so normalized in our society, and of the questioning of the victim.
The victim blaming, victim shaming.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And it's because we don't equate like sexual assault to the same degree as other violent crimes.
Exactly, because they're not going to ask you, well, what was the victim of that murder wearing?
Right.
You know,
Exactly.
they're not going to say, were they LGBTQ? They're just going to be worried about who did it.
They're on the flip side, whereas there's like a gendered norm where sexual assault is acceptable, you know, especially in positions of power, and that toxic masculinity is like feeling entitled to a person's body. And whether you say yes or no, like that doesn't matter, because as a man with privilege, like you're used to this answer yes. That's something that is in conjunction where when we're addressing rape culture, there's also dismantling patriarchy. You know, there's also the dehumanizing of people of color. And so people of color's pain is seen as less than. You know, going from like hospitals for our treatment to rape culture, where if a person of color is saying something, oh, they're the angry Black person, or they're the whatever, you know, and that's not okay. It's not a point of belief or not, and it's very heart-wrenching to hear that you're not able to speak your truth.
I think naming it is really important. Like, it's one of the things, especially like because we know that a lot of assaults and a lot of abuse come with power dynamics, come with manipulation. Like, survivors like often blame themselves and are gaslit, like not only by the people that are assaulting them, but like also by society as a whole. And so like when we say rape, when we say incest, when we say sexual assault, like, you know, we are claiming the intensity of that, like, and putting that into the story, into the narrative, you know, that we use to heal and to, you know, to speak out.
And so by naming it and like actually talking about it, we're confronting the gravity of the issue and how it is not okay, and it's allowing us to take the power back into ourselves.
And
To say the least.
it doesn't matter about
Mhm.
what race you are. People don't talk about it. You
No.
know, that
Yes.
is family violence that happened.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I'm not looking for any blame to be placed. I want a resolution to the problem.
We can also start with like trying to have accountability processes in community that are trauma informed, right? Like, and that actually like have accountability steps. Like transformative justice or restorative justice gets kind of talked about a lot, but like that's not really a great model for sexual assault, because sexual assault, rape victims, like as we've talked about, shouldn't have to like go face to face and have a conversation or a mediation with the person who has assaulted them, right?
Yeah.
And like if we're going to like have accountability processes, it can't just be like, oh, we had a conversation and somebody said sorry. Like, no, what is the follow-up there, right? Like what is the follow-up for the survivor, and then also like what is the follow-up for perpetrator, or really coming to the space of like, some people need to be removed from community spaces, or at least like, it needs to be communicated enough, not just the whisper network, right? Like it needs to be communicated loudly that that person is harmful and a risk to the other people in community.
This is something that needs to be an open process so that the community knows who the violator is. So that if there is a pattern, it can be brought to the light and there can be some kind of corrective measure taken. You cannot continue to let these people run around here unchecked. Somebody needs to talk about it. It doesn't mean that we have to go full bore, have the media all involved in it. There can be community conversations, community accountability without involving law enforcement.
So for me, I've tried to do that personally, and especially in the Indigenous community, a lot of like elder women would side with the elder men that are perpetrating, because they will say that they have personally not experienced the rape or sexual violations, right? But usually perpetrators will attack people that have like less representation, less community, more marginalized. So like when we make it about the community, if the community has not worked on their rape culture and decolonizing themselves away from that space, then like it just, you just end up hitting a wall. No matter how accountable you try to make that person out to be. Like personally, last year, I personally was, they were saying that they were going to sue me for defamation for me saying that it is not okay for this older man to touch me, and also for him to disrespect me in front of civil rights heroes. In front of the Gregorys, in front of like all the very important.
And this was defamation, so they were basically saying that he never did it.
Yeah, well, one, he's in denial, and two, I'm not the only one. There's other women, and other Indigenous women are silenced by their elders, and so it's me, an Indigenous person that's not Indigenous to North America, but Indigenous to my tribe, Burma. And so they're like, oh, well, she's not really Indigenous, so that doesn't really matter. And then there's other women that are also representing the missing and murdered Indigenous people that are not Indigenous themselves. And when they get sexually assaulted, now it becomes their problem.
That's why conversations like this are important, right? Talking to other survivors, other people that are trauma informed, to validate and like stand with, right? Because so much of what we get from people that don't understand is so gaslighting and so damaging, that like having conversations like this to like hold that space and to acknowledge and to figure out, okay, well, how do we push and what do we do? Like, you know, we're a lot stronger when we're standing in solidarity because the voices, you know, coming from other areas in society are so, you know, loud and almost deafening. So we kind of have to group together and sort of speak as one, right? And that doesn't mean like everybody's in the same process, but it's like we're all pushing for those processes, right? And supporting one another in that.
And this is why organizations like Taking Back Our Bodies and Men Healing are so important, because yes, they do the work to help heal, but they also foster a community and allow you to connect with other people who have been through what you've been through and survived. So, you know, you're not alone, and, you know, it shouldn't be a death sentence that you've been violated in the past.
So much of the system is about telling victims what's going to happen and how it's going to happen without sitting someone down and saying, what would you like to see happen? What would look like justice to you? And those conversations don't happen. Be here at this time, do this way, wear this, don't mention this, mention that. Even with some of the agencies that are there to serve victims, it's all about what the department heads and the executives and the founders want. Still not about what the victim wants.
Yeah.
Because in some cases, you don't even have a lot of them working there.
Could be multiple ways to proceed. You know, people may want to do everything. You know, they may want to have the legal system prosecute them. They also may want community accountability process where we sit down and we discuss what harm was brought to the person and how this person that did the harm is going to respond to it. What are you going to do personally to not do this to someone else? What are you going to work on as a person to understand that what you did was violating, it was wrong, and that as a community, we're coming together to tell you what our standard is without it having to be a legal recourse to it. We want you to fix and repair yourself because we don't want it to happen again. That type of behavior is not acceptable. And being unacceptable, you need to learn how to work on your own mental health.
Prison isn't always going to be the answer. You know, like she said, it should be up to the survivor what they look for. It could also be financial restitution to pay for healthcare, to pay for counseling, and maybe not necessarily right after the fact. The person might not want it until later, but it needs to be open-ended so they can at least pursue that.
You know, because that is one of the things that's kind of missing out of the fray is victim compensation.
You know, like the reparations, you know, like the perpetrator, like being responsible for paying for, you know, like if the person wishes to go through a therapy or to any sort of, you know, restorative system or process, that should be on the person who perpetrated the crime.
Like with the police, there's like a compensation thing that's happening in California for victims, that if an officer of the law is responsible for committing a rape, that their victims can be compensated whether they choose to pursue it legally or not. And I think that should be something that is all over this country, because at no point is it okay for police to get away with that type of misconduct.
Reconstruction and deconstruction of the system and the you know, the entire police system in ways of, you know, like there aren't any really people in that system that necessarily have any training or any experience in these cases. Doesn't seem to be. You know, like anybody can become a police officer. They don't really need to have any sort of, you know, like bachelor's degree, any sort of experience whatsoever. I think that should be a requirement. You know, like having a requirement where they have, you know, like training in mental health. That should be like at the top before then giving them a gun.
I've always wondered how it is that we have lawyers that go to school for umpteen number of years to practice law, But then we have these police out here that do no schooling, and
Yep.
they're out here interpreting the law because they're the first line to bringing you into the legal system. They need to be just as educated as the lawyers.
Yeah.
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 That should be a requirement.
And their internal, it should be, and their internal culture is so toxic as well, and so based in this place of, you know, bringing the nervous system up to be constantly on edge. Like, no, you need to be in a place of calm when you are engaging with people. You know, you think about all of the sort of ridiculous excuses you hear about, oh, I was afraid, or, oh, you know, it happened so quickly. Like, yeah, because you weren't mindful, because you weren't like trained to be in a high stress situation. Like, you got training from our culture and from the police academy, which is basically like, you know, training you to be violent, training you like you're a soldier, which you're not. Like, this is not active warfare. Police are supposed to be in a space of like calm when approaching people, and we see that that is like never the case ever.
But then when you, I compare the military to the police because one, when we're in hostile territories, they don't conduct themselves like the police do.
Mm-hmm.
They have a standard and a code of conduct.
Yeah.
Whereas the police do not.
Mm-hmm.
They're not just walking up to people and demanding ID and wanting to go fishing through their pockets and pulling cars over to search for drugs and things like that.
Yeah.
Our military does not do that, but the police have gotten their hands into military grade equipment for God knows what, because they see these things on these fancifulized TV shows.
Mm-hmm.
Where these things do not actually happen in real life. You do not hear about broad range shootouts with the police. That does not happen typically.
Yeah.
But then they have all of this militarized weaponry like it does, busting into people's homes that are non-threatening with militarized weaponry.
Oh, you know, I think there is a you know, like there is a place if there is an actual terrorist threat.
Yeah,
sure. But when you have peaceful protesters, when you are trying to you know, like help somebody that has been through you know, like a case of, you know, abuse, sexual abuse, like that, there is no place for that in there. So yeah, I think, you know, like there should be an entire reorganization and deconstruction and reconstruction of the system. There should be a requirement for mental health. There should be, you know, like a requirement for having, you know, some sort of education. Like, it can't just be like straight from high school. Like, it, you know, like something.
People want to quash if you have a domestic violence charge, you shouldn't be able to own a weapon because half the police or more would not be able to have a weapon.
Bingo.
Right? Which in and of itself is like, okay, that is part of the whole problem in a nutshell right there.
So there is a certain kind of personality, right? That it represents that specific group, which is pretty. I mean, it's pretty chilling if you think about it, you know, because it's like specific kind of people gravitate towards those places of authority.
There is a difference also between the civilians who work security on a military base and the MPs. Not that MPs are perfect, but I have noticed the ones that I get the most attitude from are the civilians working security on base, because they seem to kind of have a little bit of free reign, and a lot of them were civilian police officers before working there, and they used to being able to do what they want when they want without any real constraints. So the attitude is there, the arrogance is there, and it's scary.
Yeah, it's like the sort of bastion of toxic masculinity, you know, like people who are trying to embody that kind of, you know, it doesn't have to be gendered, but like that kind of, this is how a man is supposed to act, or this is what being tough means. Like, you know, people that are like, yeah, like have that personality that is trying to sort of like fit in onto that all too typical scale and, you know, way of engaging, and like, doesn't even like that personality plus no training plus weapons is like
it's a bomb.
Yeah,
basically.
and it goes off all the time.
Yeah, I mean, what I was just gonna say earlier was about like addressing that intergenerational trauma. One of the things I noticed when I was working on the suicide line was a lot of people who were talking about suicide said, you know, my mother committed suicide, my grandmother committed suicide. And all of that is because the way that we react to trauma is really what is important. And that's how we can take things back into our own hands, you know. But when we're growing up and we see people and we see our parents fighting with each other, we think that's the way to resolve conflict. But really, like, and then when you grow up, that's what's ingrained within us. If we think defense is how to resolve conflict. But I think what Tamika and everybody was saying is therapy, you know, like being able to talk to someone to really reframe that within our minds is how we're going to move forward and how we're going to take power back.
People have these issues. People can't just get over them and stuff like how, and mental health is there to help, but there's such a negative stigma of mental health and therapy that people don't go there until like it's their last resort. And then they're like, wow, I should have went there earlier, because it is helpful, but the stigma behind it is just so negative in society that people would rather do everything else than talk to a professional or take meds that they might need and stuff like that than to fix what's going on.
And that's why we're here to break that down. We have to break it down now, because if we don't, what about my grandkids are coming up? What if they get caught up in this shit?
Yeah.
I don't want them to be hurt and harmed like I was. How many years it took me to get to the place where I am today? I wasted a lot of my life because of the traumas I experienced and the lack of understanding from my own community about the traumas I've had to live through. I've basically done this on my fucking own. And people still look at me like, look at crazy Tamika. Go figure.
Yeah, you're not crazy.
I think I'm crazier than a lot of them.
Yeah, we have to keep pushing forward and bringing intersectionality to these discussions, right? So it doesn't only affect, you know, a color of skin, or it doesn't only affect one gender. I mean, like this involves all of us. This involves all of us. And in order for some actual change, it needs to be something systematic in how we address and how we live and how we communicate.
And also representative from the media too. Like, I think most people get their information from that medium. So even besides like education, if we're representing real consent and not like an attitude of annoyance, but an attitude of like responsibility for promoting autonomy, that needs to happen.
Definitely.
And, you know, we as like grassroots organizers need to push for more media representation of stepping away from rape culture.
I'm definitely glad this conversation happened. It was about time, and it doesn't need to end here. We need to continue to have this conversation. Maybe we can do this annually until it's not needed to do anymore.
Yeah.
Sounds like a plan.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I've enjoyed meeting everyone as well. And one thing I'd say, any service providers and any organizations watching this, spend more time listening to the survivors you're servicing and less time talking to us. Please.
I hope we have given people a greater understanding from the victims and the survivors' standpoint. What we need should be paramount, as ahead of what the system says we need to do.
Yeah. I've come out of this with more understanding, and you know, like I remember in the first session, Tamika, you talking really about direct action and about how like the research has already been done, and that's something that really kind of has just resonated and stuck with me throughout, like it, you know, these panels and kind of in my thinking in other arenas, because I think that's also the step too, right? Like the conversations are good and the research is good, and bringing that to other people is good, but it's you know, trying to look at, you know, what can we do too.
The challenge is getting in those arenas, and the challenge is it's reaching out to those people and I don't know, like opening a door. That's the hard part.
Yeah.
That's the really hard part. And like just trying to have a conversation, or even just changing, like the attitudes and the behaviors of someone, where like as soon as you start talking about something like this, you get shut down. So I think that's, like, yeah, I mean, I hope, I long for a day where, like we can actually have conversations like this with the people who need to see, to open their eyes more. I mean, it's great. It's great to get to know people like you all, like kindred spirits, I will say. But yeah, I think the challenge is reaching out to those people who don't.
Yeah, I think it's a balance, right? Like of moving into those spheres and reaching out in that way, and then also balancing it back. It feeds the ability, I think, to go out there and to do that more, and to do that in other arenas when there's that feeling of like connection and understanding in other areas. So like always happy to find another spot with that.
Yeah.
Before you leave, take a moment to feel into your body. Notice where you are experiencing sensation, if any, within your body. Now begin to reorient yourself to the room around you. Look to your left. Look to your right. Look in all directions, including behind you. And notice that you are safe here. Take a deep breath here. Notice the sensation of your feet and the soles of your feet. If you notice that your body is highly activated, take a few moments to stand up, move your arms and your legs, or go outside and take a walk, noticing the earth around you. Soften the focus of your eyes so you can come into your peripheral vision. If you're needing immediate support, please call the National Sexual Assault Hotline at 1-800-656-4673. To dig into healing work with a somatic experiencing practitioner, you can find a practitioner local to you at www.traumahealing.org. If you want to work in a group, you can email Melly at sahealingcircle@dreamcityhealing.co or reach out to connect@dreamcityhealing.co if you need personal support in finding the resources that are right for you. Keep doing the work. It's worth it.